Welcome. My name is Dr. Marielle Keller. I'm a senior lecturer in religious studies and an adjunct for African American and diaspora studies at the University of Wyoming. Every summer, I teach a field course in Northwest Wyoming called Heart Mountain, Icon of American Landscape. In that course, students come up from Laramie for a week after they have completed online readings. We look at 3 cultural landscapes that are centered upon the power of this remarkable mountain: the indigenous peoples, the homesteaders, and the Japanese Americans imprisoned at the base of the mountain during World War II. Let me point out a few things here. On the top right of this image is a beautiful picture of the mountain looking to the north. On the bottom right, black and white photo, you can see the same mountain in the background, looking at it from the side. This view is called Lone Heart Mountain because you only see one of its peaks at this angle. Right? So from the north, you've got the little peak, which is on the west side, and the big peak, which is on the east side. Over here, we're on the east side of the mountain, and so it gets the name Lone Heart Mountain. Also in this picture, you see the barracks and administrative buildings with hundreds of the Japanese Americans who are being confined on this barren basin at the base of the mountain. On the bottom left, you see Heart Mountain again. There's the big peak, and there in the distance is the little peak. This time from the trailhead. And this is at an event with the indigenous descendants, the Apsalaka or Crow Indians. And so during the field course, we're going to look at multiple layers and how this mountain is a real icon of American landscape. Now, the trailhead leads 4 miles from here up to the peak of the mountain. And you actually have to kind of like climb over a few rocks here, and then you get up onto the peak from there. So let's just look back at this. Now that you're getting oriented, you can see in this watercolor an image of Heart Mountain as a storm moves in. And you can see she's covered her head there with a newspaper to try and protect herself. And then on this lower image, you see here are some of the students and people involved on the pilgrimage, the return to Four Tops Father with the Apsalaka, with the Crow tribal members. And so we're about a third of the way up the mountain in this image, and we're going to end up snaking up from this sagebrush into the pine forest. This is about that transition zone where the pine are now starting to be able to survive. It's high enough altitude to get enough snow in the winter to survive through a summer. Heart Mountain was a World War II confinement site that held up to 14,000 Japanese Americans for 3 years, from 1942 to 45, part of an unconstitutional U.S. presidential order to confine and contain Japanese Americans after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So the Heart Mountain Foundation works to preserve what remains of the confinement site and to tell the stories of people unjustly incarcerated at the site. In August of 2011, the Heart Mountain Foundation opened the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, a world-class museum dedicated to teaching this story to future generations. It's a National Historic Landmark, and my students visit and engage with remarkable exhibits, films, restored barracks, restored food cellars, and the digital and material archives of the center. So, HMIC, Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, their exhibitions and programming are designed to connect our contemporary understanding of being Western with the memories and stories of the camp in order to build accurate knowledge of this chapter of the American West and promote citizenship capable of resisting future injustice. So, here's Dakota Russell with a word of welcome.
Hello, UW students. I'm Dakota Russell. I'm the Executive Director of Heart Mountain Interpretive Center up between Cody and Powell, Wyoming. We sit on the site of Wyoming's former Japanese American concentration camp from World War II and have a beautiful museum and historic site dedicated to its history. During your time in Wyoming, we would love to see you up here and invite you all to come and visit us. Thanks so much.
So, why was a camp built in Wyoming? There are at least 3 important reasons. So, this big western rectangle is the least populated state in the United States because our high desert basins, and you can see them here as these big, open, empty spaces, are high desert basins, and then these Rocky Mountain ranges. If you've ever seen Jackson in the Tetons, there's that. Here's the Wind River. We've got the Bighorns over here. This is the Bighorn Basin. You'll hear me refer to that. So Wyoming is a tough place to make a living. The government's plan was to remove Japanese Americans from coastlines and urban centers, to isolate them from any networks that could enact Japanese aggression on U.S. soil. So over here, this lower blue arrow is in Laramie, and the upper blue arrow is up in Cody, where we base our field camp. And I laugh that it takes me 7 hours and 4 turns to get from Laramie. So let's just watch that. You ready? We'd go up here 1, 2, 3, and those 2 are close. I mean, you could almost call that 1. 4, and then here we've got a major dam and reservoir, and the Wind River Canyon and the Wind River Reservation off to the side here. So after you make that 4th turn, you go through Thermopolis, the site of the world's largest hot springs, and then on up to Cody. I want to point out, not only do we have Yellowstone Lake, the largest freshwater lake above 5,000 feet in North America, we also have the Buffalo Bill Reservoir, and I'm going to mention this in a minute. And it was home to the world's largest dam in 1910, the Buffalo Bill Dam. Cody, and there's Heart Mountain, and it's halfway between Cody and the town of Powell. So, isolation was one of the reasons for the camp. But isolation alone was not enough. So, if you were to come with me on this trip, talk about being Western. When you cross the diagonal of a state like Wyoming, you'll truly experience the highest and widest basin and range country of the United States, with more antelope and cattle than there are people. But now, let's get back to the fact that isolation was one reason for the camp, but isolation was not enough. So behind me, you can see the red brick chimney, and that was the chimney for the hospital. And then closer behind me, you can see one of the guard towers. And one of the Japanese Americans incarcerated here noted that those guns were pointed in toward them as American citizens. So there was not just isolation, there was also a militarized camp with guard towers meant to make sure the people stayed in the camp. Now, a second reason Heart Mountain was chosen is that there were railroad tracks near the site, allowing for the transportation of massive numbers of people. When they got off the train, This next video captures some of the experience they encountered. And I am telling you, you cannot hardly video out here without getting into the wind. Come on in. We're going to have a look inside a restored barrack. This is what the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated up in isolated places like this northwest corner of Wyoming arrived to find on a sagebrush plain. These uninsulated barracks were put up swiftly, and they had to withstand, these families then had to withstand for 3 years the Wyoming summers and winters. The summers would have been very hot, the winters would have been very cold, with the wind blowing right through the walls. In a barracks like this, multiple families would have had a curtain to delineate their section of the barrack, and it was here that they had to make meaning and life as American citizens who were unconstitutionally imprisoned at this camp. So, here comes our third reason. The third reason was the need for labor, for irrigation canals that could bring water from the Buffalo Bill Reservoir in order to realize the dream of turning this desert into a garden. And here you see the contemporary realization of that dream. If it's green in Wyoming, it's irrigated. In the background here, this is the Shoshone Canyon, and it's in the base of this canyon that they put up the world's largest, at the time, dam in 1910, the Buffalo Bill Dam. I'll just mention here as well that this shape of this canyon is called the teepee's doorway. So here's the teepee's doorway, and it's at the base of that where the canyon was. Now, given that there were so few people, an incarceration camp would bring in the labor needed. It was going to help solve a problem. Let's have a look at that. So, in the spring of 1943, the camp's agricultural efforts got underway. And I'm going to read this out loud to you. I'm going to read it newsreel style, okay? In the spring of 1943, the camp's agricultural efforts got underway. Incarcerees had to first complete the Shoshone irrigation project, which included a 5,000-foot canal, folks. Then they cleared several thousand acres of sagebrush to make way for peas, beans, cabbage, carrots, cantaloupe, watermelon, and other fruits and vegetables. Despite the local farmers' doubts that it could be done so late in the year, the autumn harvest yielded 1,065 tons of produce. The following year, 2,500 tons were harvested. The camp raised cattle, hogs, and chickens for its own consumption. Heart Mountain had one of the most successful agricultural programs of all the camps, introducing new crops that had never before been grown in the region. So they have sweat equity in this mountain. What does this story of incarceration have to do with religious studies? This mountain has oriented people's lives across centuries and cultures. I was trained as a historian of religions, and that means I begin with sacred geographies. Mountains are always part of the stories that people tell about the ultimate significance of their place in the world. So, people across time and cultures triangulate the meaning of their lives with the power of mountains. Mountains position humans in ways that lead to the question and the answer for what is the ultimate significance of my place in the world, given the superior forces of this mountain to show me my humble and vulnerable self. So, one of the people at the camp who was in fact moved by this mountain was a Zen monk, Nyogen Senzaki. And here is a poem that he wrote, and the picture on the far right is one that he painted. Sons and daughters of the sun are interned in a desert plateau, an outskirt of Heart Mountain, which they rendered the mountain of compassion or loving kindness. They made paper flowers to celebrate Vesak, the birthday of Buddha. Above the heavens, beneath the earth, I alone am the world-honored one, said the baby Buddha, declaring the spirit of independence and self-respect of each sentient being in the world. Hey, you, stupid sagebrush and timid cactus, why don't you stretch out your green buds to answer the call of spring? As you can tell in this poem, there are multiple layers of resistance, the elevating of the dignity of all sentient beings, and the way that Heart Mountain was understood and depicted as a mountain of loving compassion that helped orient them, especially in this Zen tradition, to issues of impermanence and emptiness. So, using the literary magazine archive at the center, we see that many people say the mountain helped them survive their incarceration. And for this reason, they and their families return and make a pilgrimage up the mountain to transform, with their current freedom, their memories in the service of healing. I want to bring students up here because landmarks like Heart Mountain exert power on the whole place. The mountain directs how life can happen, impacting who can travel, where they can travel, lifting their wings, providing habitat. Heart Mountain has the power to develop what we call a cosmology, a world of meaning in which people orient themselves to the ultimate significance of their place in the world. If you were to come to UW and think about being Western, I sure hope you'd consider coming with me to explore Heart Mountain as an icon of American landscape. Thank you.